Welcome to night 2 of the Best Civil War Story. Tonight we revisit the days in September 1862 when one of the most momentous changes in American values was fought out just across the river.
I am a poor wayfaring pilgrim, while traveling through this world below. There is no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright world to which I go. I'm going there to meet my Father. I'm going there no more to roam. I am just going over Jordan. I am just going over home.
Chapter 12. The Battle of Antietam, Sharpsburg, repurposes the war and filled Shepherdstown structures with 5,000 wounded, and the echoes of indelible memories. Just before Antietam, when the Confederate troops passed over into Maryland, Davis Shepard, Jr. rode to Kearneysville to meet them and came into Shepherdstown at the head of the army on his beloved horse, Ginny. A soldier among soldiers once more, though armed with only a riding whip. The weight of his oath of neutrality seemed for a time lifted from him. War had ravaged the fields of Virginia, harvesting men. As Generals Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson coordinated a series of stunning reversals on the poorly led men fighting for the Union cause. Then Lee boldly calculated to move his 70,000 men across the Potomac River at White's Ford the first week of September into the north. He hoped to carry the momentum to a negotiated separation from the United States for the Confederacy by demoralizing and swaying voters in the northern states as they planned to vote for new congressmen in November. Virginia needed to recover and harvest its grain. Lee may have known that England had already placed on its agenda a decision on whether to throw its weight and domination of the seas in favor of a disuniting of the United States, but all pending results of fighting on the battlefields of Maryland. The deciding stage was set, but Lee knew grimly that his best fighters, who were with him that hot, dry September, could not last in a long war against the North's deep resources and manpower. He played all his cards that September. This, Lee felt, was the last, best chance for the South to strike a winning blow, and the dragons are approaching.
September 1862 was in the skies of the almanac, but August still reigned in ours. It was hot and dusty. The railroads in the Shenandoah Valley had been torn up. The bridges had been destroyed. Communication had been made difficult, and Shepherdstown, cornered by the end of the Potomac, lay as if forgotten in the bottom of somebody's pocket. We were without news or knowledge, except when some chance traveler would repeat the last wild and uncertain rumor that he had heard. We had passed an exciting summer. Winchester had changed hands more than once. We had been in the Confederacy and out of it again, and were now waiting in an exasperated state of ignorance and suspense for the next move in the great game. Surprised that the 12,700-man garrison at Harper's Ferry was not evacuated to be closer to Washington, Lee daringly decided to capture the garrison, requiring him to break up his army, which had dwindled down to just 40,000 from the 70,000 10 days prior. Men were exhausted, filthy, only semi-clad, and would at times just lay down on the grass and die. Lee sent more than half his army towards Harper's Ferry, less than 17 miles away, but in 3 very different directions to encircle the garrison commanded by a feisty general named Dixon Miles. Stonewall Jackson led the force of 28,000. Some of Jackson's men came to Harper's Ferry from the west and passed through Shepherdstown. And Mary Bettinger Mitchell recalled, "We found ourselves on Saturday morning, September 13th, surrounded by a hungry horde of lean, dusty tatterdemalions who seemed to rise from the ground at our feet. I did not know where they came from or to whose command they belonged. I have since been informed that General Jackson recrossed into Virginia at Williamsport and hastened to Harper's Ferry by the shortest roads. This would take him some 4 miles south of us, and our haggard apparitions were perhaps a part of his force. They were stragglers, at all events, professionals, some of them, but some worn out by the incessant strain of that summer. When I say that they were hungry, I convey no impression of the gaunt starvation that looked from their cavernous eyes. All day they crowded to the doors of our houses with always the same drawling complaint. I've been a-marching and a-fighting for 6 weeks steady, and I wish you'd please to give me a bite to eat." Their looks bore out their statements, and when they told us that they had clean gin out, we believed them and went to get whatever we had. They could be seen afterward asleep in every fence corner and under every tree. But after a night's rest, they pulled themselves together and somehow disappeared as suddenly as they had come.
If the federal commander, General George B. McClellan, ever knew that Lee, located just a short march to the west from his own 87,000 men encamped around Frederick, Maryland, and had scattered his much smaller army across 50 square miles with a river dividing it, Lee would have been doomed, one would think. But McClellan, in fact, did learn all about Lee's situation at just the right time to act, but Lee survived. The order that Lee shared with 3 division commanders on September 9th was being read avidly by General McClellan in Frederick's Marketplace by noon on September 13th. 2 privates using an abandoned once Confederate campsite near Buckystown saw in the debris what looked like cigars wrapped in paper. Of course, it turned out the paper was far more important than the cigars. "At last I know what to do. Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home," McClellan famously said to General John Gibbon nearby. It became one of the most dramatic battles because Jackson's men had to capture Harper's Ferry and its 12,700 men in almost no time allowed, and make the day-long march back to Lee's fragment of an army at Sharpsburg, all before it was wiped out by McClellan's advancing army of 87,000 men. In fact, hastened by the information from the Found Loss Order, the very first of McClellan's men crossed the Antietam Creek to Sharpsburg and did so just a bare 3 hours after the last of Lee's men. And the Federals, perhaps surprising the Confederates with their celerity, fought and beat the rearguard Confederates all across South Mountain, the north-south ridge separating the two armies as they advanced. Confederate wounded began arriving at Packhorse Ford, just below the sleepy Virginia town of Shepherdstown.
Monday afternoon, September 15th, at about 2 or 3 o'clock, when we were sitting around in disconsolate fashion, distracted by the contradictory rumors, our Negro cook rushed into the room, her face working with excitement. She had been down in the 10-acre lot to pick a few ears of corn, and she had seen a long train of wagons coming up from the ford, and she said, "They are full of wounded men, and the blood is running out of them that deep," measuring on her outstretched arm to the shoulder. This horrible picture sent us flying to town, where we found the streets already crowded, the people all astir, and the foremost wagons of what seemed an endless line, discharging their piteous burdens. The scene speedily became ghastly, but fortunately we could not stay to look at it. There were no preparations, no accommodations. The men could not be left in the street. What was to be done? Here they were, unannounced, on brick pavements, and the first thing was to find roofs to cover them. Men ran for keys and opened up the shops, long empty, and the unused rooms. Other people got brooms and stirred up the dust of ages. Swarms of children began to appear with bundles of hay and straw taken from anybody's stable. These were hastily disposed in heaps, covered with blankets, the soldiers' own or blankets begged or borrowed. And as night drew nearer, whispers of a great battle to be fought the next day grew louder, and we shuddered at the prospect. For battles had come to mean to us, as they never had before, to mean blood and wounds and death.
I know dark clouds will gather o'er me. I know my pathways rough and steep, but golden fields lie out before me, where weary eyes no more shall weep. I'm going there to meet my mother. She said she'd meet me when I come. I am just gone over Jordan. I am just gone over home.
Wrote Federal Officer Rufus Dawes the night before Antietam. We passed over open fields and through orchards and gardens, and the men filled their pockets and empty haversacks with apples. About dusk, sharp musketry and cannonading began in our front. It was 9 o'clock at night when our brigade reached the position assigned it. The men laid down upon the ground, formed in close column, muskets loaded, and lines parallel with the turnpike. Once or twice during the night, heavy volleys of musketry crashed in the dark woods on our left. There was a drizzling rain, and with a certain prospect of deadly conflict on the morrow, the night was dismal. Nothing can be more solemn than a period of silent waiting for the summons to battle, known to be impending. The day began overcast, but later became cloudless, blue sky, perfect day in the mid-70s. Colonel John Gordon of the 6th Alabama Infantry Regiment later wrote, "It was in marked contrast with other battlegrounds. On the open plain, there stood these hosts of long hostile lines listening in silence for the signal summoning them to battle. There were no breastworks, no intervening woodlands, no abrupt hills, nor hiding places, nor impassable streams. The space over which the assaulting columns were to march and on which was soon to occur this tremendous struggle consisted of smooth and gentle undulations and a narrow valley covered with green grass and growing corn. From the position assigned to me in the center of Lee's lines, both armies and the entire field were in view. The scene was not only magnificent to look upon, but the realization of what it meant was deeply impressive. Even in times of peace, our sensibilities are stirred by the sight of a great army passing in review. How infinitely more thrilling in the dread moments before the battle to look upon two mighty armies upon the same plain. Then the bloodiest day in American military history began in the dew and fog from a night rain.
I'll soon be free from every trial. This form will rest beneath the sod. I'll drop the cross of self-denial and enter in my home with God. I'm going there to see my Savior, who shed for me his precious blood. I am just going over Jordan. I am just going over home.
On the 17th of September, cloudy skies looked down upon the two armies facing each other on the fields of Maryland. It seems to me now that the roar of that day began with the light, and all through its long dragging hours, its thunder formed a background to our pain and terror. If we had been in doubt as to our friends' whereabouts on Sunday, there was no room for doubt now. There was no sitting at the windows now and counting discharges of guns or watching, as we did during the Harper's Ferry battle, the curling smoke. We went about our work with pale faces and trembling hands, yet trying to appear composed for the sake of our patients, who were much excited. We could hear the incessant explosions of artillery, the shrieking whistles of the shells, and the sharper, deadlier, more thrilling roll of musketry, while every now and then an echo of some charging cheer would be borne by the wind. And as the human voice pierced the demoniacal clangor, we would catch our breath and listen, and try not to sob, and turn back to the forlorn hospitals, to the suffering at our feet and before our eyes, while imagination fainted at the thought of those other scenes hidden from us beyond the Potomac. On our side of the river, there were noise, confusion, dust, throngs of stragglers, horsemen galloping about, wagons blocking each other, and teamsters wrangling, and a continued din of shouting, swearing, and rumbling, in the midst of which men were dying, fresh wounded arriving, surgeons amputating limbs and dressing wounds, women going in and out with bandages and lint and medicines and food, an ever-present sense of anguish dread, pity, and I fear hatred. These are my recollections of Antietam.
During this terrific battle, the noise was as much as the limits of possible noise could take. There were screams higher, groans deeper than any ear could hold. Many eardrums burst and some walls collapsed to escape the noise. Everything struggled on its way through this tearing deafness as through a torrent in a dark cave. The cartridges were banging off as planned. The fingers were keeping things going according to excitement and orders. The unhurt eyes were full of deadliness. The bullets pursued their courses through clods of stone, earth, skin, through intestines, pocketbooks, brains, hair, teeth, according to universal laws. And mouths cried, "Mama!" Reality was giving its lesson. Its mishmash of scripture and physics, with here brains in hand and there legs in a treetop. There was no escape except unto death. And still it went on. It outlasted many prayers.
Where are your legs that used to run? Hooroo, hooroo. Where are your legs that used to run? Hooroo, hooroo. Where are your legs that used to run when first you went to carry a gun? I fear your dancing days are done. Johnny, I hardly knew you.
Roughly 40,000 artillery shells were fired that day. Some 20-pounders traveling as far as 1,900 feet, traveling at 1,250 feet per second. Possibly 100 muskets or rifles were fired every second for hours. No one ever talks about the sound. It was a day of only thunderous sound in Shepherdstown over 2 miles away. General Alpheus Williams wrote his wife in New York City, "The roar of the infantry was beyond anything conceivable. Imagine, from 8,000 to 10,000 men on one side, with probably a larger number on the other, all at once discharging their muskets. If all the stone and brick houses of Broadway should tumble at once, the roar and rattle could hardly be greater. And amidst this, hundreds of pieces of artillery, right and left, were thundering as a sort of bass to this infernal music. It is incomprehensible and perfectly inconceivable how mortal men can stand and live under such an infantry fire as I heard today. Judging from the way the musketry roared, the whole surrounding air between the lines must have been thick with flying lead."
Cheated out of a morning meal by the order, General John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade charged with a shout as piercing as the blast of 1,000 bugles across a cornfield toward Federal positions. It was a fierce but futile charge that dropped 82% of all the soldiers in one charging regiment. Both commanding generals were ill-informed, Lee thinking his army was closer to 70,000, not yet realizing the deep loss to straggling. McClellan, always one to estimate the enemy forces at what could charitably be called the maximum possible number, McClellan acted in a way that reflected his strange conviction that Lee had 100,000 men. But what enabled Lee to manage the slaughter better than McClellan was where he chose to watch things. The more inexperienced McClellan set up shop in a comfortable home 2 miles to the north, getting his intelligence through the lens of a telescope, eyed by someone other than himself. The concluding written down orders were then galloped out to the battlefield to the appropriate commander, often long after the orders pertained. Lee, more experienced and oblivious to personal physical risk it would seem, watched with his hand seriously hurt and bandaged from his horse near the Hagerstown Pike on a knoll. There he was able to see emerging dangers and issue verbal orders directly to the intended commander. How the two generals opted to be informed almost determined the outcome. The whole day, and the war itself, was coming down to a warm discussion among Generals McClellan, Sumner, and Franklin on whether McClellan should make use of about 20,500 fresh, undeployed men into battle, right at a time unbeknownst to them, when Lee had virtually no reserves left and was fighting almost on pride alone. Thousands of well-led Federals closed in from the Sunken Lane area on what remained of the paltry Confederate position near Hagerstown Pike. Confederate Captain M.B. Miller discharged his 2 guns with spherical case and canister, causing them to leap 10 to 12 inches into the air with each firing.
With no time left, only these 2 brass guns remarkably brought down what observing Confederate General Longstreet called the aggressive spirit of the right column, led by Colonel Francis Barlow. And then another shot brought down the Federal commander of the entire front, General Israel Richardson. The Federal advance stalled, saving the Confederates. Lee ordered Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart to probe the terrain between the extreme Union right and the riverbank of the Potomac to see if there was room to press the remnants of his army around the end of the Union line in order to either escape or flank it. But the prompt, persuasive reply from 42 Union guns quashed that plan. By 4 p.m., McClellan chose to agree with General Sumner, calling off any offensive on the main battlefield and deciding not to attack Lee with his thousands of fresh bluecoats, leaving Lee able to fight again another day. Federal Generals George Greene, who captured the Dunker Plateau earlier in that day, and the wounded Joe Hooker, whose men fought all morning, both cursed at this premature quitting. Musing on McClellan's wayward thought processes to not take action, even Lee's chief of artillery, Edwin Porter Alexander, later wrote, "For common sense was just shouting. Your adversary is back against the river with no bridge and only 1 fort, and that the worst one on the whole river. If you whip him now, General McClellan, you destroy him utterly, root and branch, bag and baggage. Not twice in a lifetime does such a chance come to any general. Lee for once made a mistake and gave McClellan a chance to ruin him if he could break his lines. And such a game is worth great risks." At the same time, the Union General Burnside's drive was continuing at the bridge.
The explosives ran out, and sheer weariness supervened. And what was left looked around at what was left. Then everybody wept, or sat, too exhausted to weep, or lay too hurt to weep. And when the smoke cleared, it became clear that this had happened too often before, and was going to happen too often in the future, and happened too easily. Bones were too like lath and twigs, blood too like water, cries were too like silence. The most terrible grimaces too like footprints in the mud.
After dark, Lee's commanders drifted automatically back to Lee's tent, and each had a private conference with him. Henry Kyd Douglas ventured out into the dark mystery of the sodden grounds, where cries inside a haystack faded into mewling and then silence.
Will ye no come back again? Will ye no come back again? Better loved ye cannot be. Will ye no come back again?
The dead and dying lay as thick over the land as harvest sheaves. The pitiable cries for water and appeals for help were much more horrible to listen to than the deadliest sounds of battle. Silent were the dead, but here and there were raised stiffened arms. Heads made a last effort to lift themselves from the ground. Prayers were mingled with oaths, the oaths of delirium. Men were wriggling over the earth, and the midnight hid all distinction between blue and gray. My horse trembled under me in terror, looking down at the ground, sniffing at the scene of blood, stepping falteringly as a horse will, avoiding human flesh, afraid to stand still, hesitating to go on, his animal instinct shuddering at this cruel human mystery.
Wounded continued to overflow into Shepherdstown. When night came, we could still hear the sullen guns and hoarse, indefinite murmurs that succeeded the day's turmoil. That night was dark and lowering, and the air heavy and dull. Across the river, innumerable campfires were blazing, and we could but too well imagine the scenes they were lighting. We sat in silence and a drawing close together, as if for comfort. We were never hopeless, yet clung with desperation to the thought that we were hoping. But in our hearts, we could not believe that anything human could have escaped from that appalling fire. On Thursday, September the 18th, two armies lay idling, facing each other, but we could not be idle. The wounded continued to arrive until the town was quite unable to hold all the disabled and suffering. They filled every building and overflowed into the country round, into farmhouses, barns, corn cribs, cabins, wherever 4 walls and a roof were found together. There were 6 churches, and they were all full. The Oddfellows Hall, the Freemasons, the little town council room, the barn-like place known as the drill room, all the private houses after their capacity, the shops and empty buildings, the schoolhouses, Every inch of space was filled, and yet the cry was for more room. The unfinished town hall had stood in naked ugliness for many a long day. Somebody threw a few rough boards across the beams, placed piles of straw over them, laid down single planks to walk upon, and lo, it was a hospital at once. The stone warehouses down in the ravine and by the river had been passed by because they were low and damp and undesirable as sanitariums, but now their doors and windows were thrown wide, and with barely time allowed to sweep them, they were all occupied. Even the old blue factory, an antiquated, crazy, dismal building of blue stucco that peeled off in great blotches, which had been shut for years and was in the last stages of dilapidation.
Rescue the perishing, care for the dying. Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save.
Late on the 18th was almost moonless. Then a thunderstorm, and Lee's discovery that morning of just how weak his army had become set cannon wheels rolling quietly down the pike, the soft shuffle of men marching at double quick into the water at Boatler's Ford. 25,000 tattered men carrying wounded and getting away. All night, Lee and Jackson stood on their horses in the Potomac River as the often clogged stream of wagons and men crossed back into Virginia and home. At 10 a.m. the next morning, General Walker passed Lee at mid-river, confirming that he was the last fighting force, to which Lee said softly, "Thank God."
Netta Lee returned to her home of Bedford that rainy evening after caring for wounded all Thursday at Perrin House in Shepherdstown. When I got back to Bedford that night, I found the house, Father's office, and every vacant space full of soldiers. General Lawton had been badly wounded, and with his doctor and orderlies had Brother Edwin's room in the eastern wing. In the next room was young Tom Barlow, with a broken leg, and his brother Jack to nurse him. Jack came with tears in his eyes and asked us to care for them. They were from Williamsburg, Virginia. And my uncle, Colonel Richard Henry Lee, though not wounded, was induced by Father to stay with us. Then General Robert E. Lee's son, Rooney, had his horse fall on his leg and sprain it badly. He was in the little room next to General Lawton and remained a day or two. In the room next to my own was a poor fellow named Willis, who soon began to develop typhoid fever, was ill for weeks, and died there. In my father's office in the yard, a soldier sat propped in an armchair, holding his arm, which rested on his knee, and there was a puddle of blood between his feet. Blood was dripping from a wound, and it was small and not very painful, but it had dripped all day. We had tried to get a surgeon to tie the artery. We feared he would die before morning. At last, Mother sent a note to dear old Dr. Quigley, our family physician. It was dark and it was raining, but he came to us, with only a dim lantern to guide his footsteps. He told us he could not see to take up the artery, but he thought his medicine would clot the blood and staunch it till morning. It did relieve the patient, who slept quietly all night with a friend beside him. The next day came a report that the Yankees were crossing the river and paroling all wounded whom they could not imprison. So before they reached Bedford, our young cavalryman was propped on a horse, and with his friend they hastened to the Confederate lines. They stayed at Dr. Logie's beyond Carneysville until able to travel further. Oh, those awful days. Houses searched and men arrested without cause. Mr. Davis Shepard and a company of young men became a home guard. Naturally, he was betrayed by Union sympathizers, sent to the old Capitol prison, where he became very ill and returned home to die.
On Thursday night, we heard more than the usual sounds of disturbance and movement, and in the morning, we found the Confederate Army in full retreat. General Lee crossed the Potomac under cover of darkness, and when the day broke, the greater part of his force, or the more orderly portion of it, had gone on toward Carneysville and Leetown. The larger portion, with Lee, Jackson, and Stuart, moved west towards Martinsburg, then encamped at Bunker Hill. Their rear guard defenders under General A.P. Hill went towards Leetown.
General McClellan followed to the river on Friday morning and without crossing got a battery in position on Douglas's Hill and began to shell the retreating army and, in consequence, the town. What before was confusion grew worse. The retreat became a stampede. The battery may not have done a very great deal of execution, but it made a fearful noise. It's curious how much louder guns sound when they are pointed at you than when it's turned the other way, and the shell with its long drawn-out screeching, though no doubt less terrifying than the singing Minnie Ball, has a way of making one's hair stand on end. The stream of fleeing soldiers on the Carneysville Pike went by Poplar Grove, the home of the Bettingers, just south of Shepherdstown. And the family soon had about 100 men on the lawn, in the house, or in their barn. Described by descendant Serena Dandridge, or Miss Violet as she was known, a servant named 48-year-old freedman Abram Dixon, who she called the intelligent, devoted angel, helped the family with the overwhelming need.
When Poplar Grove was the center of such artillery shelling, and when the rest of the family was safely ensconced in the cellar, our mother, little Dansky, stayed behind despite the family's pleadings to join him in the room above. She was my sister. Finally, she closed her reading matter, R.M. Ballantyne's Coral Island, and remarked, "Now I can tell my descendants that I finished a book during a battle." Someone suggested that yellow was the hospital color, and immediately everybody who could lay hands upon a yellow rag hoisted it over the house. But when the firing commenced, the hospitals began to empty. All who were able to pulled one foot after another, or could bribe or beg comrades to carry them, left in haste.
The men were described by one of their numbers as sunburnt, gaunt, ragged, scarcely at all shod, specters and caricatures of our former selves. We had fed on half-cooked dough, often raw bacon, as well as raw beef, had devoured green corn and green apples. We had contracted diarrhea and dysentery of the most malignant type, and lastly, we were covered with vermin.
It was in vain that we implored them to stay. In vain we showed them the folly, the suicide of the attempt. In vain we argued, cajoled, threatened, ridiculed, pointing out that we were remaining and they were less danger here than on the road. The cannon were bellowing upon Douglas's Hill, the shells whistling and shrieking, the air full of shouts and cries. We had to scream to make ourselves heard. The men replied that the Yankees were crossing, that the town was to be burned, that we could not be made prisoners, but they could, and that anyhow they were going as far as they could walk or be carried. And go they did. Men with clothes about their heads went hatless in the sun. Men with clothes about their feet limped shoeless on the stony road. Men with arms in slings, men without arms, with one leg, with bandaged sides and backs, men in ambulances, wagons, carts, wheelbarrows, men carried on stretchers or supported on the shoulder of some self-denying comrade. All who could crawl went, and went to almost certain death.
Farewell, my friends, I'm bound for Canaan. I'm traveling through the wilderness. Your company has been delightful. You who doth leave my mind distressed. I go away behind to leave you, perhaps never to meet again. But if we never have the pleasure, I hope we'll meet on Canaan's land.
They could not go far. They dropped off into the country houses, where they were received with as much kindness as it was possible to ask for. But their wounds had become inflamed. Their frames were weakened by fright and overexertion. Erysipelas, mortification, gangrene set in, and long rows of nameless graves still bear witness to that result. Our hospitals did not remain empty. It was but a portion who could get off in any manner, and their places were soon taken by others who had remained nearer the battlefield, had attempted to follow the retreat, but having reached Shepherdstown, could go no further. We had plenty to do, but all that day we went about with hearts bursting with rage and shame, and breaking with pity and grief for this needless waste of life.
Among the new arrivals from battle, Edward Moore of the 1st Rockbridge Artillery with George Bettinger, and Steve Dandridge made his way to the Bettingers' home in Shepherdstown. If Steve Dandridge was indeed present at Poplar Grove that day, he would not have known that within 15 years he would marry one of its inhabitants and spend the balance of his life at this home as it became his own.
Moore wrote, "On the following day at our hospital, the heap of amputated legs and arms increased in size until it became several feet in height, while the two armies lay face to face like two exhausted monsters, each waiting for the other to strike. About sundown that afternoon, I was put in an ambulance with S.E. Moore of the College Company, who was in a semi-conscious state. Having been struck on the brow, the ball passing out the back of his ear. The distance to Shepherdstown was only 3 miles, but the slow progress of innumerable trains of wagons and impedimenta generally, converging at the one ford on the Potomac, delayed our arrival until dawn the next morning. About sunrise, we were carried into an old deserted frame house and assigned to the bare floor for beds. My brother David, whose gun had remained on picket duty on this side of the river, soon found me, and at once set about finding means to get me away. The only conveyance available was George Bettinger's mother's carriage. But my brother's horse, the same brute that had robbed me of my bed in Leesburg, now refused to work. The booming of cannon and bursting of shells along the river at the lower end of the town admonished us that our stay in this desolate old house must be short. As brigade after brigade marched by the door, the apprehension that they in whose wars I have borne my part would soon have all passed by made me very wretched. As a last resort, I lifted up upon the back of this same obstreperous horse and in great pain rode to the battery which was encamped a short distance from the town. S.E. Moore was afterward taken back to the Bettingers' residence, where he remained in the enemy's lines until, with their permission, he was taken home by his father some weeks later.
With so many starving soldiers begging, food became scarce at the Grove, and the family, like many, lived largely on cornbread and dried apples. We presently passed into debatable land. When we were in the Confederacy in the morning, in the Union after dinner, and on neutral ground at night. We lived through a disturbed and eventful autumn, subject to continual alarms and excursions. But when this Saturday, September 20th, came to an end, the most trying and tempestuous week of the war for Shepherdstown was over.
Some wounded rebels did not get back to Virginia soil. The innovative medical director of the Federal Army, Jonathan Letterman, reported afterwards, "In addition to our own wounded, we had to care for 2,500 Confederate wounded from the Battle of South Mountain, Crampton's Gap, and Antietam. Those in houses progressed less favorably than those in barns. Those in barns less favorably than those in the open air, although all were in other respects treated alike. With wounded from both sides, on both sides of the river, Dr. Abner Hard from Illinois led a covert advance with a regiment that surrounded Shepherdstown and its surprised inhabitants. Confederate officers were taken prisoner, and Dr. Hard rounded up Edwin Gray Lee, who was visiting his parents at Bedford, and he was released a few days later in early October in a prisoner exchange."
Dr. Hard wrote, Friday, September 26, 1862. Ascending the hill through a deep ravine, the body of a soldier was discovered, too much decomposed to be recognized. Near the village of Shepherdstown, we encountered the rebel pickets who beat a hasty retreat. But our movements were ordered and executed so quickly and with such celerity that the village was surrounded and occupied before many were aware of our presence. The place had the appearance of one immense hospital, nearly every house being filled with wounded which had been taken from the Battle of Antietam. Among them were some Union prisoners, which we provided for with great pleasure. We drove the enemy some 3 miles beyond the town and took about 30 prisoners, among them Lieutenant Colonel Lee of the 33rd Virginia Infantry. He was finely mounted and equipped and expressed himself greatly chagrined at being captured. Toward evening, the regiment returned to camp with their prisoners, proud of their day's work. On Sunday, the 28th, our newly appointed chaplain, Reverend Philo Judson, arrived and preached his first sermon. Monday, the 29th. While halting for a short time at Shepherdstown, our wounded men found there were conveyed across the river in small boats and sent to Sharpsburg. While engaged in the discharge of this duty, we observed in charge of a hospital near the river took especial pains to prevent our going around a certain house. Our suspicions were aroused, and thinking that there might be some soldiers secreted there, one of the officers of the regiment was made aware of the fact. He at once instituted a search, though strenuously opposed by the family. No soldier was found, but a fine cavalry horse with full equipments was discovered in a cave in the hill, which made an excellent addition to our own animals. A few miles further on, at a farmhouse, we found Colonel McGill and other rebel officers suffering from severe wounds. The colonel had an arm amputated at the shoulder, which for want of proper care was alive with maggots. After dressing their wounds, we learned that the colonel had been educated at West Point and was a classmate of General Pleasanton. Friday, October 3rd, 1862, Henrietta Bettinger Lee writes her daughter, Ida Rust, in Loudoun County.
Your dear letter came safely yesterday. It was a balm and comfort to my tired mind and weary body. Your dear father returned from his exile about 2 weeks since, when our army passed into Maryland. Oh, what a time we have had with that army. The fight near Sharpsburg filled our town to overflowing with wounded and dying men. Every vacant house, every church, and nearly all the private homes have been full. I had 11, and with their attendants, 16. Now I'm sitting by your father's sickbed. For a week he has been quite ill with typhoid. Yesterday his fever left him, but in spite of all our entreaties, he would get up and he would eat some cheese. The consequences were a horrid night and more fever. I am very nearly worn out with anxiety and watching. Added to this is a sad case upstairs, a young man who has been ill since the battle. He was badly wounded, and then typhoid set in, and now, for several days, he has been in a dying condition. Oh, he cannot survive this day. I have another young man in Eddie's room who's doing well, though he was badly wounded. The others were removed to Winchester, though many were utterly unfit to go. The shells from Ferry Hill passed over the east wing of Bedford, trimming the trees in the garden and scaring old Kezia, who was digging the cabbage bed, out of her senses. 7 of the shells were picked up unexploded. Oh, how many desolate homes, orphan children, and widowed mothers has this vile, cruel, and oppressive war caused. Your dear brother Edwin came from a bed of sickness in Lexington to see us last Thursday. I had not seen him since last spring. The Yankees were informed of his visit here by this vile old Abram Snyder, whom he met in the road. They surrounded the house, captured him and his pet horse, which had been stolen, and to recover which he had that day paid $75.
Dr. Abner Hard's regiment came looking for officers while Edwin Gray Lee was sitting on the portico of Bedford using field glasses. His younger sister, Netta Lee, was about to go to town to buy some hops to make a hops pillow for her sick father. Getting word of approaching Yankees, Edwin rushed to the stables, saddled his horse, and fled across the fields in the direction of Morgan's Grove. Unfortunately, he got into the swamp, where the Federals found him and captured him. Henrietta Lee continues.
Edwin was paroled, but his horse, revolver, and saddle were taken from him. He's with us now, but expects to leave tomorrow in order to be exchanged. Poor fellow. Old Ginny, which he hired as a cavalry horse, was also stolen the night before last, or rather captured, as his rider was in a house in town, and a Yankee came along and took the horse off. I have not been in town for nearly 2 weeks. 2 wounded men died at the rectory last week, and Lila has been sick, but is recovering. Now, Annie did not get home to stay those days with me. The days she arranged to come, all the wounded were brought in. But Annie's well, and her little children are very sweet. Tippy spent the day here on Wednesday. She's as precious and lovely as she can be, and I think the young captain she has taken a fancy to thinks far more of himself and his promotion than of her. He is very full of himself, that is certain. Tippy always speaks most lovingly of you and wishes she could see you and be near you, as who does not? As to the federal provost marshal in Sharpsburg, no tyrant of the old world ever displayed greater despotism. Is it not sad that so many of our poor wounded should be in such hands? Heaven shield us from their grasp. Now, our own Mrs. Edwin Lee writes as if she hoped you would come and spend the winter with her. But there's still so much uncertainty. I suppose you have not yet decided. It's thought that Mary Dare Perrin has made a conquest of Mr. Tinsley, who's here attending the sick and wounded. I can't say much for her taste. He's staying at her mother's, is from Williamsburg, and an acquaintance of Edwin's. He dined with us, but he did not take my eye. I could fill several sheets with interesting accounts of our wounded and sick soldiers, and I do say if we have had a specimen of the way the physicians treat those poor men throughout our southern land, it is no wonder they die in scores. It seems to me this war has crushed our humanity from the hearts of men. Oh, that it might please God to end it and give us back our loved ones to our homes and hearts again. Oh, I could amuse you by the hour with some items. Especially, I wish I could transcribe a note I got from a gentleman during our season of confusion and nursing. It was a rare note to send a lady. The last of Carey's wounded left a week ago. Colonel Calhoun of South Carolina parted with tears and sobs. Poor fellow. I could have wept with him. But, darling, my paper is nearly exhausted. I fear I will find this rather bulky for my envelope, but I will squeeze it in. Thank your dear husband Armistead for his kind, sweet letter. This letter must answer his and yours, as I have a scarcity of paper and envelopes. Kiss him and the precious boy and little Becky for me. My heart is pining to see you all. God our Father bless and keep you all for Jesus' sake. Ever your loving mother. P.S. I have no strength or wish to read this over. Let no eye see it. Destroy it as soon as read.
Earlier on Monday, September 22nd, President Lincoln had given the bloodbath that was here a reason with his most lasting action, the announcement and later signing into law of the Emancipation Proclamation, making the carnage at Antietam part of a war for the freedom of the enslaved. A young nation would continue killing itself for issues so divided and hopeless that many entrusted solutions to Providence alone. The war would rage down its long, dusty path for 30 more months, leaving this nation with a deep, everlasting, contemplative scar. And some were nobly saved to become the last best hope of earth.
In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make us holy, let us live to make all free, while God is marching on.
Chapter 13, September-October 1862. The Bower. If these walls could talk. After the Antietam battle, Confederate men crossed at Packhorse Ford below Shepherdstown, while General Jeb Stuart's cavalry crossed further upriver at the more dangerous Shepherd's Ford. After a final battle Saturday, September 20th, at Shepherdstown at Packhorse Ford, they all went into camp to rest, eat, and debug themselves. Stonewall Jackson's men encamped at Bunker Hill below Martinsburg with General Lee, and then Lee further south to near Stevenson's Depot. Federal Commander George McClellan confounded and vexed both the enemy and President Lincoln with the myriad reasons he doled out for not restarting the fight with Lee's recovering but weaker army, choosing instead to vacation, as it were, on the Maryland side of the Potomac. Even Stuart's cavalrymen mocked McClellan's inertness in early October, taking General Lee's order to recross into Maryland and to Pennsylvania and to ride around the entirety of McClellan's army, grabbing 1,000 horses en route. This staged show of strength had the additional purpose of keeping McClellan indecisive. Lee was also by this show politically influencing mid-Atlantic voters who would soon cast votes for a new Congress. This chapter, however, is about how Jeb Stuart and his 150-man staff and friends found paradise at the Bower and made the most of it for a month. The Bower was the home of Adam Stephen Dandridge, the friend of Alexander Butler. Years before, you may recall that Dandridge introduced Butler to his future wife at Princeton, New Jersey. Now, the fun and hijinks of these men at the Bower, coming directly from a most horrible scene, have become the stuff of legend. The Bower, looking west from its magisterial perch atop a hill along the Opequon, remains to this day in the Dandridge family. One can only surmise that after the Dandridges extended their hospitality to Stuart's contingent, the cavalryman's departure must have left the Dandridge family cleaned out of provisions and extremely vulnerable to retribution by the federal armies. The legend of the Bower. Serena Catherine Dandridge, one of the two eldest young daughters of the Bower's owner, wrote,
The host and hostess welcomed not only their friends, but their friends' friends, to what was merrily nicknamed Liberty Hall. The resources of the house were manifest. Fat cattle in the pastures, poultry in the surrounding hills, many gardens in the rich bottomlands in front, with 50 servants always at one's beck and call. Every bit of room availed to hold a guest. In the attic and on vast mattresses thrown down in lack of other accommodation, the children dreamed sweetly of the morrow. Back of the house lay numerous terraces and plots, planned and planted by the artistic taste of my grandmother. Here, amidst the rich shrubberies, we'd look sheer across the valley, from the Blue Ridge to the North Mountains, all over the lovely land. We gloated on the paradisical beauty of the beloved home, and loved to put a wealth of flowers about it, and to read its praises written, as they often were, in prose or verse.
Monday morning, September 29th. Eros van Bork first sees the bower. Weather very warm, dry and dusty. When I arose from my grassy couch at sunrise on the 29th, I found indeed that the half had not been told me of the bower. Our headquarters were situated on a hill beneath a grove of lofty umbrageous oaks, a primitive growth which extended on the right towards the large mansion house, the thick brick walls of which, in the blush of the early sunlight, were just visible in little patches of red through the rich verdure of the embosoming garden. At the foot of this hill, skirting a main road to which the slope was smooth and gradual, ran the bright little Opequon, its limpid waters breaking through and tumbling over the hills and rocks, thus forming a cascade of considerable height, with rainbows in its spray as the sun changed every falling drop into a ruby or a diamond. This lovely entourage was now enlivened with diversified by the white tents of our encampment. The generals, with its fluttering battle flag in the center, by the smoke of the campfires where the Negroes were busily engaged in cooking breakfasts, by the picturesque groups of officers and men who were strolling about, cleaning their arms, and by the untethered horses and mules which were quietly grazing all over the ground. One may be pardoned some extravagance of language in attempting to describe a scene which brought a feeling of thankful happiness of the soldier, weary of the excitement, the toil, the hardship, and the anguish of war. We had now plenty of food for our exhausted animals, which had undergone so much fatigue and privation, and our own commissariat was far more abundant than it had been for many weeks. The long mess table, at which we dined together in the open air, was loaded with substantials. It seemed dainties and luxuries to us, for often days together had gone without food, and at best could secure only a meager repast. Frequently, when the mocha, of which we had captured a large supply from the enemy, was smoking invitingly on our breakfast table, we had the pleasure of greeting the proprietor as a welcome guest at our morning meal at headquarters. Later in the day, the ladies' skirts might be seen in the streets of our encampment, but regularly every night we proceeded with our band to the house, where dancing was kept up till a late hour.
Evening, Wednesday, very early morning, Thursday, October 1st and 2nd, Shepherdstown, Virginia. Stuart and Von Bork visit the home of Lily Perrin Lee, East German Street, Shepherdstown, Virginia. And she gives Stuart the silver spurs that her husband wore when he died at the First Battle of Manassas Bull Run. These were the spurs that Stuart was given years earlier, and that he had graciously given to her husband and his close friend, William F. Lee. While visiting, Stuart also invited her and many of the town's young ladies to a ball at the Bower. Thursday weather. Forenoon, quite warm. Afternoon, thundering, small clouds passing around. Evening, fine breeze sprang up. Netta Lee recalls how she and a group of older, more sophisticated Shepherdstown ladies rode in a van provided by Confederate General Jeb Stuart, visiting her relative General Robert E. Lee, and going to an unforgettable night of dancing and festivities at the Bower.
Now, we had just returned from Bunker Hill, where we had been to visit General Lee, whose headquarters were there. I had messages from my mother and Mrs. George Robinson and several others. These greetings I was not forgetful to promptly deliver to General Lee. And when he told me goodbye, he graciously put his arm around me as he sent his love to my mother, saying, "Take this kiss to her, too. Mwah. And here's one for Mrs. Robinson. Mwah. And last but not least, this one for your sweet little self. Mwah." Ooh, evening, Tuesday, October 7th, the Bower and the Grand Ball. Netta Lee continues describing the Bower and the ball after coming from General Lee. When I arrived at the Bower, a servant brought up an officer's card for the ladies of Shepherdstown. At once Margie Boatler said, as she read aloud the card, "Major Frank Huger." "Oh, I know he has come to call on me. I met his cousin in St. Louis." But Eliza Hamtramck knew somebody else who knew him and thought he had come to see her. I modestly remarked, "I wonder if he can be my brother's old chum and schoolmate at Mr. Ben Hallowell's school in Alexandria." Well, Cousin Lily called to us to hurry down, and I followed the others to the porch below. The older girls were first to be introduced, and then came my turn. And when my name was mentioned, Frank Huger came quickly across to me, bowing low and offering his hand, saying, "I came here especially to see you, Miss Lee, for I am sure you must be the sister of my old chum, Edwin Lee. Am I not right? And may I shake your hand?" Well, I did feel a little triumphant, for I had been called bread and butter all along the trip. And yet I got 3 kisses from our General Lee, and he called me his sweet little cousin when he gave me mine. Evening, Tuesday, October 7th, the Bower and the Grand Ball. Sweeney's Orchestra, as described by William Blackford.
We had at headquarters a capital band of singers who were accompanied by Sweeney on his banjo, Bob, the general's mulatto servant, on the bones, and occasionally by a violin and other instruments. But the main standby was Sweeney and his banjo, and every evening at the Bower, this formed a part of the entertainment. The music program: Grand Overture, Orchestra; Cottage by the Sea, Sweeney; Lily Dear, Sweeney; When the Swallows Fly Homeward, sung by Stewart; Look a there now, Captain, Tiernan Bryan; Going Down to Town, played by Sweeney; Ever a Thee; Money Musk; The Separation; I Ain't Got No Time to Tarry; Evelyn; Lively Peace; Soldier's Dream.
Now Blackford gives his account of the ball's mysterious, uproarious couple, the Pennsylvania farmer and his wife, actually Von Bork and Bryan.
One evening, when there was an invited company with the parlors all full, Van Bork and Bryan gave us another capital performance. They were to appear as Patty and his sweetheart, Mr. and Mrs. Dandridge were the only two persons in on the secret, and Van Bork and Brian were taken secretly upstairs for preparations under their care. Van Bork was transferred into a blushing maiden weighing 250 pounds, 6 feet, 2.5 inches tall, a riding skirt of one of the girls, supplemented by numerous dainty underskirts and extended by enormous hoops according to the fashion then in vogue, hung in graceful folds to conceal the huge cavalry boots the huge damsel wore. Her naturally ample bosom palpitated under skillfully arranged pillows and was gorgeously decorated with the Dandridge family jewelry and ribbons, while a love of a bonnet, long braids of hair, and quantities of powder and rouge complemented her toilet. And on her hand she flirted coquettishly a fan of huge proportions. Colonel Brian was admirably disguised as an Irishman dressed in holiday clothes with a flaming red nose. Billycock had a short pipe and a short, thick stick stuck under his arm. The absences of these two had been accounted for on some plausible pretext, so that when they made their appearance in the ballroom, the surprise was complete. Both acted their parts to perfection. Paddy entertained the fair girl on his arm with loud and humorous remarks as they sauntered around the room, to which she replied with simpering affectation that was irresistibly ludicrous. No one had the faintest conception as to who they were, so perfect was their disguise. Before the company recovered from the surprise of their appearance, the music struck up a lively waltz. And round that couple went. Faster and faster went the music, and faster flew the strangers. It was not until in the fury of the whirling dance, with hoop skirts flying out horizontally, that twinkling amid the white drapery beneath, the well-known boots of Van Bork betrayed the first suspicion of who that lady was. As suddenly as they had come, they vanished, waltzing through the open door and followed by convulsive roars of laughter from the delighted audience. Nothing would satisfy that company but their reappearance. And then they came, arm in arm, to enter into conversation with their friends. The skill of their disguise and their acting was now even more remarkable than at first. It was really difficult to detect their personalities even then.
And Von Bork himself recalled, "So joyous the night went on with dancing and merriment until the sun stole in at the windows, and the reveille sounding from camp reminded us that the hour of separation had arrived." Sunday, October 26th, Stewart's Born in the Saddle Horsemen play Double Dare Ya. Von Bork's Revenge. Von Bork challenges Blackford and Stewart to riding daring-do. This occurred 2 weeks after Blackford and Stewart led 1,800 cavalrymen in a madly dangerous ride around Federal General George McClellan's entire army, driving deep into Pennsylvania and coming back triumphantly to the Bower. And Von Bork was specifically ordered to stay behind at the Bower and not join the expedition, possibly due to his reputation for running horses hard to exhaustion with his considerable size and weight. Now, the following might have been Von Bork's defiant answer for this subtle insult. He himself recalled, "On Sunday, the 26th of October, there was a grand review of Hampton's brigade, which was attended by the ladies from far and near, and as the day was lovely, it proved a fine military spectacle. When the review was over, the officers of our own Hampton staff assembled to witness the trial of a diminutive 1-pound gun, which turned out to be of very little account. And afterwards we had some equestrian sports, matches in horse racing and fence jumping. Captain Blackford, who with a thoroughbred chestnut mare attempted to take a high fence, just in advance of Stuart and myself, had a severe fall, which was fortunately unattended with no serious consequences. Remarking upon it that, in my opinion, the fault lay not so much with the horse as with the rider, Stuart said, "Here, old Vaughan, how grand he talks." Then turning to me, he added in a banter, "Why don't you jump the fence yourself if you know how to do it better?" I had never leaped my heavy-built Pennsylvanian as yet, and I was in doubt as to whether he was equal to that lofty barrier, but as there was no possible escape from Stuart's challenge, I struck my spurs into his side, and over he went like a deer. Amidst the loud applauses to the general himself and other spectators, I now had the laugh on my side, and very soon afterwards had the opportunity of bantering Stuart, which he could say and do nothing in reply. Returning to camp, we took a short cut, a road that led through a field of Indian corn, upon getting to the farther end of which we found that the fence usually pulled down at this place had been recently put back up, making a formidable barrier to our farther progress. Stuart and the others, observing this, turned off to the right, towards the main road. But seizing my opportunity, I cried out to him, "General, this is the way!" And clearing the 5-barreled fence in a splendid leap, I arrived at headquarters several minutes in advance of my comrades, who I welcomed upon their approach, rallying my chief very much for not having followed my example. Our long and delightful sojourn now drew rapidly to its close. Guest after guest departed, and every day the indications of a speedy departure became plainer. At length, on the 29th of October, a hazy, rainy autumn day, the marching orders came, and the hour arrived for the start. A number of the staff did not fail to indulge in the obvious reflection that nature wept in sympathy with us at the separation. With heavy hearts indeed, we left the beautiful spot and bade adieu to its charming, kindly inhabitants. Silently, we rode down the hill, and all along the margin of the clear Opequon stream, musing on its joyous hours that had passed away, hours which those few of our dashing little band of cavaliers that survived the mournful finale of the Great War will ever hold in grateful remembrance.
How can I bear to leave thee? One parting kiss I give thee, and then whate'er befalls me, I go where honor calls me. Farewell, farewell, my own true love. Farewell, farewell, my own true love.
This concludes the second leg of our journey of the Civil War story. You can find out more about the story by reading the 98,000-word narrative at Civil War Scholars, right, on a bad day, and by watching the videos on YouTube. But tomorrow night, the conclusion of the story will be about the burnings and the families involved, and above all, about one thing sacred, the home. We gratefully thank all of you who came, and we thank Terry Tucker for marvelous music and selections. Our readers, Homer Speaker, Ardith Gilbertson, and Jim Surkamp. The people that have given us this wonderful evening also are John Bloomquist behind the doors there doing the light and sound, and Rob Perks doing video. Thank Dean Seiler for the treasures that he provided to us from Your Papa's Attic on German Street. Give it a visit there. They're all period. Jan Hafer, we thank you. Laura Bacon for everything you've done, and for the not the Black Arts, but the Black Box Art Center. You can do that somewhere else. For hosting us. So, drive safely and good night. We hope to see you again. There's tickets available outside for tomorrow night right now.
Thank you for coming.
Turn your lights on.
Okay.